Alright, in this video, we're going to look at 9 different techniques to help you craft better and more interesting bass lines. The truth is, most producers don't spend nearly enough time working on their bass lines. They're so focused on everything else in the track that they just neglect it entirely. So in this video, we're going to make sure that you're getting the most out of your bass lines and making the best tracks that you possibly can. Now, these are tips that any producer can use, so no matter what genre you're working in or what level you're at, you'll be able to apply all of these techniques into your music, so be sure to stick around. We're going to start this video off with a few basic concepts, just make sure that we've got our fundamentals down, and then dive into some more advanced techniques later. Alright, let's get right to it. I've got a track that I'm working on, and the bass line in this track incorporates all 9 of these techniques. Let's take a listen, and then let's break down each of these techniques further. So tip 1 is to play with the rhythm of your bass line. Now this is a pretty basic concept, don't yell at me yet, but it's step 1 to ensuring that your bass line is as interesting and as exciting as it can be. When most producers approach creating a bass line, they simply just follow the root note of their chords and call it a day. They'll end up with something pretty boring and stale like this. Although this bass line sounds fine, there's honestly nothing exciting about it that can grab the listener's attention and make the track any better. So applying tip 1, we can add an interesting and unique rhythm that fits with this bass line. For example, even if I add just the slightest amount of rhythm to this bass line, it's going to make the track a lot more interesting. Works fine for now. I could also try adding some more development and variation. Just doing something quick and dirty like this. Let's take a listen with a bit more rhythmic activity and development. So that sounds pretty good to me. There's obviously a lot more we can do with this bass line, but it's a lot more interesting than the one that we started off with, where all of the notes were just 1 bar long. All right, so tip 2 is to add syncopation to your bass lines. Now this is a pretty common and standard technique. Syncopation, for those of you that don't know, is essentially when you accentuate a off or weak beat. Syncopation is a great way to add rhythm and movement to a track, and it's very fitting adding syncopation to your bass lines. There's already some syncopation in this bass line with all of these notes that aren't hitting directly on one of the strong beats. So this G, the first one is hitting directly on the 1. That's not going to be adding any syncopation, as opposed to the second G, which is hitting a 16th note before beat 2. When it's right here, it's going to be adding some syncopation. When it's hitting directly on the 2, it's not adding any syncopation at all. So for example, I'm just going to push a few of these notes so that they're hitting directly on the beat, removing any syncopation. So when I got rid of that syncopation, this bass line sounded a lot more robotic. If I put it back in, the bass line is going to have a lot more movement. One of my favorite syncopation techniques is to push the 2nd and 4th bass note a little bit earlier before the bar line. So in this case, I've just got a 2-bar bass line, but you could do something, what about something like this? Listeners are so used to expecting chord changes to happen directly on the 1, so by pushing the start note of some of those bass lines or some of those chords earlier or later, it's a great way to create some variation and excitement. So tip 3 is to play notes other than the root note in your bass line. So what exactly do I mean by this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, when most producers approach creating a bass line, they simply just outline whatever the root note of their chords are. If their first chord is a C major, their bass likely is going to be playing a C. However, there are no strict rules that say you can't play other notes with your bass. For example, the first chord in this progression is a G minor chord, and I've got a G in the bass, and this sounds perfectly fine, but there's a lot more room for development and variation. For example, I could take this G and try to find other notes that to me sound like they work. Don't love that A. What about going up to a D? could do that again. What about with this A? So the chord above this is an A minor chord. So I could try to find another note that's going to sound good. What about going up to the C? So there are essentially two ways to figure out what notes are going to sound good with your bass line. The simplest approach is to simply just use your ear and try to find other notes that work. That's exactly what I did here. I experimented with different notes for this bass line to find another one that works. The alternative is to use a more theory-driven approach, using what are called chord tones and non-chord tones. So if you want a more theory analytical answer to this question about where can you go with the bass line, that's definitely something worth looking into. But otherwise, you can simply just use your ear, play around with different notes to give your bass line a bit more spice. I'm just going to do that again with a couple other of these notes. Already sounding a lot better just with the 3 tips that we've talked about so far. All right, so tip 4 is short and sweet, and that's to add octave jumps to your bass line. So octave jumps are essentially when you're on a note and then the next note that you play is an octave above that note. So I've got G2 and I've got G3 here. This technique is great because it pretty much always works because you're playing that exact same note, just an octave higher. So there's not a big harmonic change to your bass line, but because you are playing a note an octave higher, it gives that bass line some exciting energy. So I brought this G up. I'm going to do that again with this A, and let's just take a listen to that right now. Like I said, it's a simple and easy way to add some energy to your bass line. All right, so tip 5 is a really important one, and that's to play with the rhythm and timing of your bass line. Far too many producers ignore this. They do not put nearly enough attention into the swing and timing of their bass line, and this leaves their bass line sounding inhuman and stiff and doesn't add any type of rhythmic or groove element to the track. So tip 5, like I said, is to play with the rhythm and timing of your notes in order to create a more interesting human groove and feel. Now, the specifics for how to add rhythm and groove to your bass line are very genre dependent, so I can't cover everything in one video, but for now, let me just show you a couple ways that I might make the rhythm and timing of this bass line a bit more interesting. So right now, every single note that I have in this bass line is hitting directly on the grid, which is a bit stiff and robotic. Let's just take a listen to it right now. For example, I'm going to select all of these notes and I'm going to push them a few milliseconds later. So I'm just making small millisecond adjustments. Now you can see instead of hitting directly on the grid, these notes are hitting a little bit later. So let's take a listen to this bass line with all of the notes pushed back by, let's just say about 30 milliseconds or so. So this bass line's a lot more swung. To me, it grooves a lot better. Like I said, it's going to be very genre dependent, but it's something that's super important to think about. Outside of changing the timing of all of your notes, it's also important to think about the timing of individual notes. For example, instead of changing the timing of every single note in your bass line, you could adjust the start position of just a few. For example, I could push these notes a little bit later. That way I've got a good balance between notes that hit directly on the grid and notes that add a bit of swing. A little bit much, I'll push this back. So in this case, this bass line isn't nearly as exaggerated and swung. It's a good middle ground between the two. So like I said, tip 5 is to think about and experiment with the timing and rhythm of your bass line as a whole and of the individual notes. So tip 6 is to think about how the amp and filter envelope in the synth that you're using can affect the rhythm and feel of your bass line. This is a super important concept, and it's essentially thinking about not just what notes you're playing, but how those notes are being played. The ADSR settings in your filter and your amp can either make or break your bass line. This is going to be a very genre-specific concept, but let me just open up the synth that I'm using for this bass line and show you how even subtle adjustments to the amp and filter can affect this bass line as a whole. So the synth that I'm using is Repro 1, pretty straightforward. We've got the filter and amp with our common ADSR settings. Like I said, I'm just going to play this bass line back for you, and I'm going to play around with these different settings and just notice how much the bass line as a whole, the character, feel, all those different things are influenced by the ADSR. Unfortunately, there are no absolute rules that I can give for how to make sure you have the right filter and amp settings, but more than anything, I just want to encourage you to experiment with your amp and filter settings with your bass, as with every other instrument, to make sure that you're getting the most out of that synth. Even with the exact same MIDI, subtle adjustments to the filter and amp made drastic changes to this bass line as a whole. So tip 7 is similar to tip 6, and that's to think about the length of all of the notes in your bass line. Small, subtle adjustments to the length of your bass notes can either make or break your track, so it's really important to play around with the length of all of the notes in your bass line to make sure it has the rhythm, groove, and feel that you're going for with that bass line. This is going, again, to be a pretty genre-specific thing, so there's no absolute tricks that I can give you, but for now, I just want to encourage you to really think about the length of all of those individual notes. If you're not sure where to start, just go and study some of your favorite tracks, and that'll give you a good indication for the amount of variation and development you want with the length of your bass notes. For example, here I've got the bass line that I played you in the intro, and as you can see, every single note in this bass line has a bit of a different length. These are a bit longer, and even within these three, you can see I've got different lengths going on. I've got some short notes here, and there's just overall a lot of development and variation. I'm just going to play you this bass line back first as it is right now, and then I'm going to make some adjustments to really convince you how important this is. So let's just say instead of putting some tender love and care into the length of these bass notes, I made them all so they were just about a 16th note long. Listen to how much the rhythm and feel of this bass line has changed. Overall, this sounds fine, but I like the previous version a lot better. Part of the reason I don't like this version is it feels a lot more stiff and robotic. Part of that is because all of these bass notes are the exact same length, and in the real world, that just wouldn't happen with the bass player. So, like I said, it's really important to think about the length of all of your notes in your bass line. So tip 8 is going to be one of my favorites, and that's to introduce melodic fills to your bass line. You can think about melodic fills in the same way that you might think about drum fills. Generally, it's going to be comprised of a short sequence of rhythms towards the end of a phrase that just push into that next loop or into that next bar. So for example, a common place that you'll see melodic fills is towards the end of a loop. Instead of just keeping the notes how they are, I could do a quick succession of notes that picks up the energy and pushes into the next bar. So notice how this last sequence of notes really just pushes the track into the next bar. It's a great way to add some excitement and development to a bass line, and also to help transitionally to make your track flow a bit smoother. It's easy to go overboard with melodic fills, so if you are thinking about incorporating them into your track, generally it's best to do so towards the end of a phrase, especially when the track might be starting to drag a little bit and you want something to grab the listener's attention and something that'll help push your track into the next section. So the last technique is something that I hear in a ton of music from the pros and something that not nearly enough beginners and intermediates use. And that technique is to add subtle development and variation to your bass line. So what exactly do I mean by this? Well, when most producers create a solid loop, they'll simply just duplicate it or loop it across a section and then call it a day. The obvious problem with this is it makes your track way too repetitive and boring. A more creative way to develop a section is to add subtle development and variation to that core idea. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, instead of just keeping your loop looped across, a better way to approach this in an honestly more interesting way is to consolidate that core idea and make subtle adjustments and variation to the second half. So here I've got the original 2-bar bass line, and I've got the same 2-bar bass line in bars 3 and 4. So what I'm going to do is make small changes to the second half of this bass line so that the second half feels new but familiar. I'm just going to use my ear to make small, subtle tweaks that are to my liking. So I'm going to push a couple of these notes later, earlier. I might add, remove notes, whatever it is, just so that this second half feels new enough, but also isn't too different from the original. So like I said, I pushed this G a little bit later. I don't love this gap here, so maybe I'll walk this down a little bit. And maybe instead of this A going all the way up, we just go back up to the C. So let's take a listen to this. Focus on how I made a few subtle, small adjustments to the second half of this bass line, and it was enough to make this feel like a 4-bar bass line instead of just a 2-bar loop that was duplicated over. One last adjustment I want to make is by pushing this G a little bit later. Let's take a listen to that. So just by making a few small adjustments to this bass line, I've taken what was a 2-bar idea and made it into a 4-bar idea. Although this may seem insignificant, it's a great way to make your track more interesting and exciting and less repetitive, which is a common problem that a lot of producers run into. All right, so that's gonna be it. These are 9 tricks and techniques that you can all use to craft more interesting and exciting bass lines. It's now on you to incorporate these techniques, study your favorite tracks to make sure you're getting the most out of your bass lines and making the best music you can. If you've got any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one.